just ask a big round of applause.
So I welcome questions during this because I'd like to hear how people view a lot of what I've been working on. This really has been an endeavor that I've been involved in for almost 20 years now. And the interesting thing that as a child, I always felt a calling to look at the economy and try to figure it out, which is really unusual because you consider a child 8, 9 years old feeling that calling when the economy really is one of the more boring subjects out there. You know, it's interesting, and yet money is one of the more exciting subjects out there. And so we have some sort of a bifurcation there in our thinking. So I really didn't do much in the way of learning about the economy until about 23, 24 years ago. And I had been involved in learning how to broker commercial real estate loans. So if you had a shopping center and you needed financing, you came to me and I would find your financing. I started this in the late 80s, and of course, within a year or two of getting my feet on the ground, we had the S&L crisis, which meant there was no money for commercial real estate projects, which meant I had all the borrowers in the world. Everybody wanted money, but nobody was there to provide money. So I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Every customer, but no ability to provide a product to them. So in 1990, I figured I'd have to get a different career or I'd have to find some source for money. And I conceived of this crazy idea that, well, why don't we take a lot of their loans, 100 loans or so, for $100 million, $200 million, and we'd put it in a pool and we'd go to Wall Street and we'd sell bonds. And that's how we would raise the money. Now, Louis Ranieri at Salomon Brothers had taken savings and loans and taken their mortgages and put them in pools and sold bonds. So he'd done some pioneer work on that. But the savings and loans guaranteed they'd buy back the loans that went bad. And the loans had been seasoned for years, and these are brand new loans originated by me, and I certainly wasn't going to be able to buy them back. So it was a different animal. And the borrowers came swarming in, and I became an expert at structured finance, not even knowing the name of it at the time. And I created senior substructures with derivatives, and I quickly learned it because I was okay at math, and math went really well for that. And so I had all these structures for different bonds that would come out, and I still hadn't talked to any investment bankers. It was still in my head. And, but the borrowers would sit down with me and they'd say, well, has anyone ever done this? And I'd say, no one's ever done it. If you have a choice, go get your loan somewhere else. But if you don't have a choice, maybe you take a chance on me. And guess what? Almost nobody had a choice back then. So I quickly grew a pool of several $100 million, all by myself in Boulder, Colorado. And then I began to think, I'd better go see some investment bankers. Well, fortunately, the investment bankers loved the idea. I got the rating agencies on board, and we did the very first of the structured pools with commercial real estate. And just for the record, we had no credit default swaps in them. I was always against credit default swaps. And in the idea of a credit default swap came up with the first pool, and I kind of calculated would it make sense. I went back to the investment bankers and I said, it'd be crazy to use credit default swaps. This doesn't make sense. And so we didn't. And so for years in the 90s, structured finance was a very powerful thing. And it did something to change my life because I didn't think of it as something that would change an industry or give rise to an industry. I thought of it as a way that Scott Smith could raise enough money to lend people so I could earn a living. But we teamed up with DLJ, and a couple of legendary guys there who went on to become legends were at DLJ. And as we talked about this idea, they said, everybody's going to want to do this. This is going to replace banking as we know it. This is so much cheaper to raise the money and so much more efficient. And so I suddenly realized, oh, you mean we would have competition on this idea that I just came up with? Oh. And so we said, well, how long do you think we have? And Mike Recco, who you've probably seen movies about him, he was at DLJ. He said, Scott, I think maybe we've got 24 months. We said, well, let's hit the ground running. 6 weeks after we launched our first pool, every major investment banker had a conduit program. And that was March in 1993. And in January at the Super Bowl, Nomura Securities ran Nomura direct ads on the Super Bowl. It took off, and trillions of dollars of these mortgages were originated. And in the 90s, they were good, all good, because there were no credit default swaps. And so much money came pouring into the economy because of commercial mortgage securitization that we began securitizing residential loans and securitizing car loans and credit card receivables and equipment leases. In fact, by the end of the 90s, every type of debt that existed was structured and securitized on Wall Street. So you're talking about tens of trillions of dollars of debt that took this form. So by about 94, 95, I could see the writing on the wall that this had kicked off something. There was a cloud of dust and I was left behind in it. But I could see that a good idea could materially change the entire economy, even by somebody who had never studied an economics class in his life. For the record, I never took a finance class or a business class either. But in a way, that's good, because you're forced to think outside of the box. You don't have preconceived notions, because if I had known better, I would have never tried structured finance. Because for the first 2 years, everybody told me it couldn't be done, but it can be. And it was around the end of the 90s when they began to put credit default swaps, which meant you no longer had to look at the careful structure and the underwriting, which was the underpinning of everything that we had done. You just put this stamp, and it got a AAA rating. That's when I left the industry, because the writing was on the wall. There's just no way that would work. And it didn't, as we saw. It almost brought down the Western world. So in the mid-90s, I started looking at the economy, and back then we had a debt of, I think it was around $2 trillion, which I was just like, oh my word, that's just gonna do us in. And we had a deficit. We actually had 2 years under Clinton with no deficit, but we were running a deficit, and it was just getting worse and worse and worse. And I would listen to the arguments of the Democrats and the Republicans, and if you listen to a Democrat, it's the Republicans fought why we're in this mess. And if only we could get rid of the Republicans, everything would be fine. But if you listen to a Republican, it was all the damn Democrats. And so I started running a really interesting analysis that changed my life. I said, okay, well, what if you got rid of the Democrats? And if you took the Republicans and you just cut the budget, there's a trickle-down effect of where all that cash is going. The government spending always ends up in somebody's pocket who's a consumer. And you would do the economy in. If you cut the economy enough to close the deficit, is almost a 25% cut in all government programs. It's huge. And so I thought, that wouldn't work. But on the other side of the coin, we'd have to raise our personal income taxes by 80% to close the deficit. And we all know we wouldn't be able to make that. Not only would we not be able to make it, but consumer spending would crash and burn that way too. And so I began to look at it, and actually, if somebody had said to me, okay, Scott, you can be the president of the United States in 1995, and you figure the solution out, I would have looked at them straight in the eye and said, I don't think there's a solution. I think we're dead in the water. In fact, I think it's way worse than people are saying, because if you track that debt, it's not that long till the country can't survive it. And so I began to really studying it, but I started studying it from a sense of urgency because I began to realize, my God, it's way worse than the Democrats and the Republicans are saying, and they don't have any answers. And it was really scary. And after a while, I began to think, am I the only person on the face of the earth who thinks we're going to go into a brick wall? And it's not just the United States, it's most of the nations in the world have this problem to various degrees. And so I started studying it in earnest, and I made a pledge to take 2 hours off every day, at least, and I go to the C library, and I didn't read, I just modeled things, just like in structured finance. I made up societies and I simulated what you could do and what could you not do, and that was my area of expertise, and it was fun to do it, but it was always so disheartening because it was so disastrous, the consequences. And then I began to think about things, and I thought, you know, it's an interesting thing. My dad was always a doomsayer, and in the 1970s, we only had till the end of the 70s, and we were going to crash and burn, and he'd show me all the economics of it, and he'd convince me he was right, because he was a good logical thinker, and the numbers spoke for themselves, but we did get past the end of the 70s. And in the 1980s, my dad was even more adamant about it, and it was going to crash and burn. He thought the S&L crisis was it, but we got through that. And in the 90s, he's saying the same thing, but I noticed something that was really curious. My life had materially changed for the better, not because I was really making more money, but because of technology. The cars had anti-lock braking systems, they had airbags, they had CDs, they had, you know, you name it. There was, the internet was starting, everybody had PCs, and when I was a kid, cars didn't even have automatic locking. You had wind-up windows. It had an AM radio, not an FM radio. And materially, life had changed for the better. And as I thought about it, every decade, materially, life was changing for the better. We were getting richer and richer from a material perspective. And if you went back centuries ago, there was no king that had transatlantic air service. None of them had a telephone. None of them had a car. None of them had running water. Well, some did. But they didn't have hot water, and it wasn't very good. But you see my point. Life was changing, and yet the monetary world was falling apart. And I started thinking, if somebody was looking at Earth from a telescope, with a telescope from outer space, they'd see what you see is what you get as the economy. They'd see a bunch of physical people running around, some of them producing things, and some of them consuming things, all of us consuming things, and some of us producing things. And our lifestyle was what we produced and what we consumed and how hard we had to do that. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to, you know, and let's say we looked at another planet and we saw they all had their own personal flying car, and they lived in 20,000 square foot homes, and they populated all the different planets of the solar system, and they had instant communication between these planets, and none of them had to work because everything was done by robots. We would say, oh my God, these guys are way better off than we are. And then if we started getting their news feeds and their stock market had just gone down by 50% in value and inflation was running this, and we conclude, rightly so, there is a disconnect between the monetary economy and the material world. And I started thinking, well, gee, maybe there's a disconnect between the material world and the monetary economy. But what does that mean? You know? So I thought, I'm going to start modeling material economies. So I came up with a hunter and a farmer and a handyman, and all these guys lived in this little imaginary village, and guess what? I could simulate everything in the economy from just a couple of guys in a village. You could have inflation, you could have deflation, you could have everything, except one thing. In a material economy, you can look down on this little space of land and you can say, that guy's the leader, and these three guys are government agents, and sometimes they hire this guy out of the private sector to build a public works thing. So you can have a government, you can have a public and a private sector in the material economy, and you would, and you can see it from a telescope and you can understand it. But in a material economy in which no one is using money, you could never have a federal deficit. Now that seems, what do I mean by that? The budget in a material economy is your wish list. Our Army needs 15 Jeeps. We need an aircraft carrier. We need this many miles of roads built. We need these many schools. We need this many teachers. We need blah, blah, blah. It's a list. And whether you get that done that year or not depends upon the human resources, the material resources, and the technological resources. And you either get it done or you don't get it done at all. You never get it done and owe something to the future, because it's either done or it's not. And so the truth of the matter is we could perfectly well afford the government we had because everything got done. And I was thinking, wait a minute, where's the deficit? It's all getting done. We can afford everything we do or it doesn't get done. And I started modeling that more, and I was convinced that was right, but I spent the next 5 years trying to figure out what in the hell that meant. Because it's okay in the material world, but I knew the monetary deficit was real. I knew it was. It's not like you can pretend like it's not there, but what does it mean? Where does it come from? It's a construct, an artificial construct of the money supply. What's wrong with the money supply? So I started adding money back to this little economy. Guess what? As soon as you add gold, you can have a deficit like that. And it can be a debt that grows. It's just basically contracts between people with respect to this gold that were ill-advised, and you have it. And you can get all sorts of problems. You can have a shortage of money, so the same guy who made enough of these widgets and this guy who made enough of this, if they didn't have enough gold, they couldn't buy each other's products, and they're standing there looking rather stupid because they have plenty of material goods, but there's not enough money to complete the transaction. And I began to understand money in a new fashion. And I began to look at our money supply and saying, where is this coming from? Because we started at the stage in which we used gold. So it's kind of like we're using transportation system from the 1600s or 1700s, trying to use it today, it wouldn't work. We're using a monetary system and a way of thinking of the money that was created in the days of gold, and now we live in a different world. We live in a world in which the government can print money. And that was a scary thing to people for one reason, because what if the government prints too much money? We have inflation. Too much money, we have inflation. But so I started thinking, wait a minute, the government is the source of our money and it needs revenue? You know, why do you have to pay somebody money if they print the money? And the reason is because if they just print money, you'll have inflation. We're really not in the business of balancing the government's budget. We're in the business of balancing the money supply. Because you just can't have a government printing money without taking money out of the money supply so the money supply doesn't inflate. So taxes were a way to take money out of the money supply so the government spending would put new money in there. And so was borrowing. You had to take some out. But the problem with borrowing is you'd agree to pay it back. And you begin to get this ball of wax that grows on you, and it becomes a problem. And so I thought, okay, within a money system like that, there are different ways to balance it once you understand that. The government's not needing revenue, and it doesn't need a piece of your revenue. It just needs to be taking money out of the monetary system to make up for the money it's putting in. So in other words, you could go to the Fed and you could say, look, we authorize you to write a check for $3.6 trillion for the government spending next year. But that $3.6 trillion is going to have to come out of the money supply somewhere. And you know what? There's actually a very easy solution to that. You see, we've become fixated on income and retail sales as the transactions we have to tap into. When the truth is, the range of transactions is enormous out there. And in fact, when you look at the math that's going on, the answer is so simple that I cannot believe that it took 20 years to arrive at the answer for me. Every day there's $1.9 trillion deposited in our banks. In a year, that's $475 trillion deposited in the banks. We're just trying to get $3.6 trillion out to make up for the $3.6 trillion going in. 3.6 trillion divided by 475 trillion is 0.76%. If we had a law that said every time there is a new deposit, irregardless of who made the deposit, 0.76% was taken out of it. It wasn't sent anywhere. It was just taken out, deleted from the money supply. So you deposit $100 and 76 cents isn't there anymore. You're credited for $99.24. That means 76 cents is gone. It's off the ledger sheet. The government can print the other 76 cents, and it's all a balanced equation. So by removing 0.76% of every deposit, you no longer have to have any income taxes at all. No more Social Security taxes, no more Medicare taxes, no inheritance tax, no gift tax, no customs tax, no excise tax. It balances. But you are taking 0.76% of every deposit. So it means if you sold your home and you lost $50,000 and you deposited $200,000, you'd only get 99.24% of what you deposited. There's no free ride. But I'd rather have 0.76% of everything I put into the bank taken away, so I have 100% of my paycheck. And it's an amazing thing. That is what I call transactional evaporation, because you're essentially mimicking the water system on Earth, in which the rain falls into the lakes, runs through the streams, across the land, into the ocean, nourishing the land as it goes. If you took 40% of the rainfall before it hit the ground, you'd have a deficit. And you'd also have a drought, and it would be a real problem, but imperceptibly all across the land, across the ocean, everywhere, a tiny amount of water molecules are just constantly streaming up, and they balance the rain. And it's a cycle. And the government can print $3.6 trillion, no problem, and you'll have no inflation or anything. You'll have no more deficit, no more growing debt, if 0.76% of each deposit goes away. That number will change over time, of course, a little. But it's way easier to monitor that. And suddenly, I began to realize, wait, we're in the business of managing the money supply. That's what the Fed does. And how does the Fed manage the money supply right now? Changes interest rates. It's a double whammy when you do that. When you increase Fed fund rates a little, you're doing it to slow the economy down. You want things to go slower, but at the same time, when you're dialing up interest rates, you're making the cost of goods go up because everything is borrowed. And so what you're doing is increasing the cost of goods while you're slowing the economy down. It's a very unhealthy way to do that. But if you have transactional evaporation, the money supply does have to grow, and it does have to shrink at times. But as the economy grows by 5%, the money supply needs to grow by 5%. So you just dial down transactional evaporation, and the money supply matches the real material economy. And that is all we want, is correlation between the monetary economy and the underlying material economy. And so the shocking news is, we'll slip through this real quickly. I start off with something that if somebody had come up to me even 5 years ago, before I had this last piece, and said, hey, I know how we can balance the budget and we can get rid of income taxes, I would have said, you are from Mars. You're insane, because there is no way that can be done. See if this will flip through. Well, it may not. Let's try this. So this is why I saw the problem. This is the breakdown of revenue, whoops, for the government. 1.1 trillion coming from personal income taxes. This 1.6 trillion, that's kind of a rounded number, comes from corporate income taxes. It comes from inheritance taxes, customs taxes, all the remaining taxes are here. And then the rest is borrowed, okay? So you've got about a third, a third, a third. This is more than a third, but when you look at that, you've got this much deficit. It ain't going to come from raising this. And it's not going to come from here. It's bad. And at $16.5 trillion in debt, this is growing. So another 10 years, we're at 25 trillion. Right now, we're at $52,000 of debt for every man, woman, and child in the country. That it's going out of hand. So that was the problem. And this is the solution. That's how much comes in each day. Now that number varies, that's a ballpark. For 475 trillion, if it's 500 or 450, same thing, 0.76%, it's less than 1%. In other words, what I'm saying is, let's say you're in the 35% tax bracket, I'm saying you can be in the less than 1% tax bracket now. You have any idea what that does to the economy? Our economy runs off of consumer spending. We've been putting a stranglehold right on the flow that creates consumer spending. That's the beginning of the waterfall. That's our economy. It's exactly where we don't want it. This is exactly where we do want it. Those are the taxes we wouldn't have to pay. Those are the big ones. That's a nice one to go away, alternative minimum tax. Came about because when people said, look, this is scary, we can't be fair anymore. Deductions don't count. That's an act of desperation. But I understand their desperation. This is what the bottom line comes. If you make $100,000 a year, you're paying about $27,500. That's taxable income of $100,000. Transactional evaporation is $760. This is the interesting part. We haven't really talked about it, but it's implicit in what I've said. You've got a $16.5 trillion deficit. How much do you need to get rid of $1 trillion more each year? Another 0.2%. So in other words, at 0.96%, you're not only balancing the budget, but you're getting rid of $1 trillion each year. The good news is the government owns $5 trillion to itself, and the Fed owns another $1.5 trillion of our debt. That debt, once you've balanced the budget through transactional evaporation, they don't need the Social Security Trust Fund. There's about 150 trust funds that the government has for a variety of different things that earn interest. They're earning interest off their own debt. That extra money goes to help make up the deficit. The deficit's actually a little bit bigger than we show it because the interest helps pay that down, but that's a wash. It's not real. So you can erase this piece and you have 10 trillion left over because the rest of it is 5 trillion owed to foreign governments and you got to pay them back. And the other 5 trillion owed to ourselves, 1 trillion to individuals, and then it's about another trillion to states, and all the rest is in pension funds and various things like that. But you could really pay this off at $1 trillion a year with another 0.2%. And even within there, the actual proposal I have, so we're putting together a formal book on this, there are 4 solutions in it. Transactional evaporation is the first solution. There are other ways that the debt can be paid off, and that gets to be a little more esoteric than this discussion goes into, but it's actually one of the most fascinating endeavors I've ever looked into. I really have an interesting observation on that. All 3 of the world religions in their earliest scriptures forbade usury, and I know why. Usury is not mathematically tenable within a monetary system. Usury makes your monetary system, in essence, a Ponzi scheme. The monetary value of your monetary unit will go down if you have usury. Interestingly, the Bible did allow people to charge other nations usury. It's okay to destroy their money systems. It's fascinating. There was way more wisdom in it than I ever imagined. And that's, but so the 4 solutions that I have, the first one is transactional evaporation. The next one I call coupon stripping. And it's a way to get rid of the federal deficit. I think it's really more like 8 years you can get rid of the federal deficit without inflation. And most of the time, you probably don't have to charge that 0.2% to do that. The third solution is an interesting one, and in a futurist society, you might really enjoy it the most. The third solution is called transactional capitalization. It is not possible without transactional evaporation. In other words, you can what it comes down to is when you start modeling these economies, you begin to realize that after the Industrial Revolution, we became more efficient at producing things. And we moved over to a stage unwittingly. What's the biggest problem that businesses have today? Getting enough customers. That wasn't the biggest problem businesses had a couple hundred years ago. It was producing enough goods. Well, when you get to the stage that people are able to produce more and more and more out of a single factory, unemployment becomes a natural side effect of that. If you draw it all the way to the futuristic limit, someday robots maybe are making everything for all of us and none of us work. Well, let's go to that example. If none of us were working, how are we going to buy the goods from each other? You see the problem. The problem becomes inherent in an advanced technological society. There comes a point in time in which businesses can produce more than the people out there can buy. You know, the wealthy people can probably buy whatever they want, but then you've got the rest of people. Transactional evaporation is the recognition that there's a cap on the producers of this world. If you went to General Motors and you said, guys, we're in a jam. Next year, for the next couple of years, we're going to need twice as many cars. They'd say, hallelujah. We can produce twice as many cars. That's not a problem. We'd have to gear up. It'd take a little while. But that would be their dream come true, is to produce that many cars. That's the case for almost any producer out there. Not every single thing, but most producers out there can produce a lot more than they're producing today. But you need the money in the hands of the consumers, not in the hands of the businesses. You can give GM a lot more money, but if they can't sell their cars, what are they going to do? If you distributed, and this is just for numbers' sake, for argument's sake, this shows you the power of this. If you distributed $1 trillion evenly among everybody in the population, everybody would get $3,174. It would cost 0.2% to reabsorb the $1 trillion, which you would have to do, otherwise you have inflation. So a family of four making $100,000 would get over $12,000, and they'd pay $200 back. Why is that possible? Because that doesn't seem right, doesn't it? Doesn't it seem like if you distribute $1, you should get $1 back? And so that puzzled me for a long time, but there is a very straightforward reason. As a civilization becomes more productive, and let's say here's your little set of factories, and you can produce more and more and more and more, and there's not enough producing jobs, you begin developing banking jobs, insurance jobs, government jobs, non-producing jobs. You begin producing an entire monetary economy that gets very fat all around this core of producers because they're making as much as you can have. And you need capital for these people to be buying things. So what we have is such a huge other piece of the financial sector that by tapping and taxing that, the people who actually got money to buy production only pay a small part of it back because the rest of that economy is paying that back. That's where we are today in our economy. We are in a situation in which our productivity is so high that our system has not kept up to it. The last part, the fourth piece of the solution speaks right to that, and it's called Banking 2.0. When a society gets in that stage, you start seeing things like the financial sector taking 40% of corporate profits, which is what it takes today. You don't really want the management of money be taking almost half of your corporate profits, but that's the level of financial fat we've developed. And so Banking 2.0 begins to correct that. So those are the four basic solutions, but if we have questions specifically, maybe more on transactional evaporation to start with, that might be a great idea. And also, I'm a little hard of hearing, so I'm going to repeat your question, and if I say the wrong thing, just like, wave your arms and go, that's not what I said. Oh, the question was, how many times does a dollar change hands in the course of a year? So in classical economics, they call that the velocity of money. And the velocity of money is calculated by taking the gross national product and dividing it by M1. which is the money that you and I have in the bank. And it only changes hands a few times according to that velocity of money. I don't really believe that velocity of money. And then there's M2, and then there's M3 that they don't calculate anymore. And if deposits in banks are mostly not from M1. And in fact, the actual total deposits in banks is a little shocking. It's not that many trillion dollars. Money completely rolls over many, 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 many times. We don't have good solid data when you go to the Fed. Well, okay, first of all, there are a lot of transactions that are avoiding taxes because from the corporate or the personal point of view, they're creating a loss. Okay, so when those bank deposits go into the bank, there was no tax collected anywhere. So the great example on a personal level is selling a house, having a loss, and depositing it. You would write that loss off today, and it would avoid other taxes. You would be taxed on that today. Okay, but many of the transactions are financial in the insurance company, and they're in the financial sector. That's the part of our economy that has the most money and is moving the most money and is making this 40% corporate tax. So you're really beginning to tax those sectors more heavily than individuals. And the other thing to remember, when you look at financial sector, it says 40% of corporate profits. That's after they paid the guys on Goldman Sachs.
So let's go to something else.
And the thing within Banking 2.0 kind of pulls that last shield off. And it's definitely the Fed that prints it, and it's that multiplying effect in commercial banks that allow the Fed to print more money. Banking 2.0 allows the Fed to continue to print that money to manage the money supply, but in a much more elegant way, and one that Greenspan would like, Volcker would like, but maybe the guys that are in Citibank, Barclays won't like it. Some banks will love it, but business will love it because that is where our clogged arteries are right now. The issue is monetary systems work best with one currency and with one authority to actually print that money. And generally, the proposals to have a state bank are to try to sequester the state away from some of the madness, but it's not saying we're getting rid of the US dollar and we're having the Colorado dollar and the rest of you can go to hell in a handbasket. This is what we have. It's kind of what you would have to do, but then you're always going to have exchange rates between your state and the rest of the country. You'd be in the same thing as the Forex market.
Could you flip that then? Could a foreign country then engage in this as an activity without necessarily cooperating with other foreign countries?
Yes, foreign countries, because if they already have their own currency, it would be very easy for them to do this. Now, generally, the bigger the country, the better. The more powerful the country, the better, because that's the name of the game in the foreign exchange market. What this proposal, especially when you get into Banking 2.0, begs, and it's a charged thing to say, but a single world currency makes the most sense and gets rid of an awful lot of problems. And it would actually be very easy if the US implemented this, then go into Europe and say, hey, listen, we can get rid of your problems. And you'd subsume other banking jurisdictions under one, and things would be better that way. Harkens to the Illuminati and the conspiracy and all that kind of stuff. I'm totally aware of that. But from a mathematical, logical point of view, that is where you'd want to go if people were well behaved.
Well, that's the question. It seems like if you have a closed system, how do you avoid leakage? You do this in the U.S. Would the Chinese want to invest here or not?
Yeah.
Because they lose money as part of their deposits.
Yes, well.
Start put money in their mattress because they lose money as part of their deposits.
So what Tor's asking here is, if you don't have a closed system, i.e., we've got our Fed and our own government, and there's China out there, what happens? It goes to the foreign exchange issues. The foreign exchange market is one of the most fascinating and sometimes arbitrary things that occur out there, and there is an awful lot that nations do to compete with each other, because it is to different nations' advantages to have their currency strong and to other nations' advantage to have their currencies weak. For China, it's to their advantage to have their currency weak and our dollar to be strong. People don't realize that. And that also goes to that, how you pay off your debt. The last thing China is going to do is use money we pay them to pay off their $1.2 or $1.1 trillion to create any sort of inflation. They're kind of up a tree if we do that, but that's a whole different thing. Money going back and forth between nations becomes an issue, and one of the things that people say is, there's two steps of this. One thing people say is, oh my God, everybody would move their money to other nations. The thing is if you have your money in other nations and you're making money, you're generally making taxes. Now Ireland, we have certain special things there. But what I believe would actually happen is we would see a flood of currencies coming into the US. We would become a very popular place for foreign investment, because the United States, one of the things it's not talked about, it's not discussed much, but the United States is currently the biggest offshore banker there is in the world. We beat Switzerland hands down. And we've reflected in our own laws. Our Treasury Department has been very effective in going to other nations and saying, you got to report to us. We don't report to them very much. And we like it that way because we have a lot of money from the Middle East, especially from Scandinavia, from all these different places in our country. What they don't like in our country right now is they do pay, if they go and make they invest in one of my startup companies and they double their money, they pay taxes to the US government on that. If you switched it over to this, you would be the biggest tax haven there is in the nation, globally. We would be a superpower, bar none, under this system. And under that system, that's when subsuming other currencies under our system would be favorable both for the country subsumed and for us. The way you would actually do that, let's use an argument. You go to Kenya. One of the biggest issues Kenya has is not enough money in the hands of the people. It's kind of a crazy thing. We were in exactly that same boat in about 1780 when we started building a lot of factories and we had a lot of production, we had a lot of material production. We didn't have enough currency to support the trades, which is why we started selling tobacco so we get the European currency. We didn't understand money enough to realize we could print it. We just didn't see it that way. But we could have, and it would have worked just fine, and we would have had a jump on the rest of the world. But right now, in the African countries, mostly they don't have enough currency. So an odd thing would happen. If we went to Kenya and said, okay, look, I'm going to make these numbers up. These are totally made up numbers. Say there's 3 million people in Kenya and their average income is $2,000 a year. If we went to Kenya and we said, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you $1,000 a year per person of transactional capitalization. That's dollars, US dollars in their hands. And we're going to pay all your government's bills. And we get to evaporate every transaction in your nation. And there's a math equation to determine what that rate is. It might be more like 3 or 4% for you guys. Because it would. They don't have as big of a monetary thing. When that money goes in those hands of those people, they want to spend it. The vendors from all over the world arrive to build the Walmarts, to build their houses, and many in their own population become vendors. The producers rise out of the ashes and they begin building a productive economy. And a little bit of transactional capitalization creates a lot of economic activity. And you now essentially own their currency. I mean, it's your currency and you own their system, but you're benevolent and you can do a lot more to change a third world nation through this system than you can through, kindness and other things. So the question was, how would you sell this concept to the 60+% part of our population that are so poor they don't pay taxes? And I don't think people realize what the lower 50%'s net worth is and income is in our country. And I don't want to wager the guess, but I've heard figures that is shocking. We don't see them here. But half of our population is in abject poverty. And so they don't care so much because they're not having a big chunk taken out of their income. But they are the key to what I call the latent wealth in our nation. The latent wealth, let's just look at General Motors. We can determine the latent wealth that's hidden in General Motors, okay? And I'm going to make the numbers up again. But let's say General Motors is producing 500,000 cars a year. It's automating its factories. It doesn't need as many people anymore. It's got a lot of dirt cheap real estate around it now. And if you went to General Motors and you said, we're going to give this much cash out into the economy through transactional capitalization. We've now calculated that 1 out of so many people, they're going to buy a car. And so now instead of 500,000 cars, you can sell 1 million cars. They'd say it's not a problem. The question is, how many cars could General Motors sell? And let's say it's 5 million. The latent wealth in General Motors is 4.5 million cars a year. That's the latent wealth. We've built a system that can produce that. We don't use it because our monetary system is askew. And transactional capitalization in the hands of those people who can't afford would take production across the nation like that, and a percentage of them would become producers, et cetera, et cetera. We are at this crazy stage in our evolution in which only a relatively small percentage of our population actually has to be producers, and yet we're still of the mentality of about 1800, when it was true that everyone had to pull their weight. When I was modeling those little economies, that when you're at that stage, it's the ripple effect of one person not pulling their weight is surprising. But when you have, at the level of our production, not everyone can pull their weight, but unless they're consuming, the people who are producing are artificially capped. It's crazy. It was not at all the way I looked at things. I generally had a fairly conservative bend before I did this. I was a social liberal because I loved to help people, but I thought, you know what, you got to be realistic about the numbers. First and foremost, that comes before your heart. I used to say things like that. Now I find the truth is really amazing. You can supercharge the economy through transactional capitalization. And why can't you do it today? Because Krugman talks like that. Spend your way out of the recession. Because you can't dump money into an economy unless you have a system to get it back out. Otherwise, you will inflate the money supply and you will have inflation. And if your only way of getting it out is the stranglehold on income taxes, there's no way to get that money out. So you can't do it. The only way you can do it is transactional evaporation. That opens the door to getting rid of the deficit, the debt, and supercharging the economy. It's interesting. So as productivity increases, what's the effect on money? Okay. The money supply is elastic, okay? And in theory, your money supply must expand to accommodate an expanding material economy. What we have today that kind of throws that off is, let's say this is the money supply that relates to our material economy. This is the money supply out there that doesn't relate to the material economy. That's the $60 trillion of derivatives being traded and things going back and forth there. Now, I was one of the pioneers of derivatives, and I can tell you there's no business trading $60 trillion of derivatives. They don't really have value. They have value. They have around $2 trillion of value, real value. So we've got this huge economy here. We've got this little economy here. This little economy, the issue is how much of that is in the hands of the consumer, you know? And more of it in the consumer, the better it supercharges. So we may have to, this piece is not going to siphon over. It's there. It's probably going to grow proportionately to this one anyway. It's the reason that the fact that this grew and has other things to do is the reason that we do sport a $16.5 trillion debt and we don't have 50% inflation each year. Because that's a big issue, but that's why. And so what you do is you do need to grow that, and you do it by dialing down transactional evaporation. So if what you're thinking is, can production go fast enough so you don't need to evaporate anything? Yes, that could happen. I'm not predicting it does. There's no models, there's no way to actually do it, but it is possible. It's kind of, that would be the weirdest thing in the world. Can you imagine that? It would have to grow really fast, though, to absorb it, because it goes back to the gentleman's point about how many dollars are there really. So really, I would, based on what I've seen, if you have about a 10% increase in productivity, you're going to want about a 1% increase in the money supply. It's not a lot, but it's a good point. You guys are very fast on your feet thinking about concepts that are pretty much just very foreign up until recently. Let me go back to my comments on that. The only reason that I'm a little dubious about those types of things is the foreign exchange between the state and the rest of the nation and what that does logistically. Is it possible for a state to say, hey, we're going to print our own dollars and we're going to evaporate them and do that? You could do it. And could you use transactional evaporation and supercharge your state? You could do it. God, it would be messy. And to the point of what you're saying on credit cards have fueled the consumer spending for the last several decades, and they are the reason our economy has done as well as it has. It is effectively transactional capitalization. The only problem with credit cards is that the guy doing the buying is on the hook to pay it back and pays huge interest rates, and that is detrimental to the nation. It's a separate issue, but you are absolutely right. Credit cards, in essence, was transactional capitalization. So is cash for clunkers. That was transactional capitalization. But they occurred without the benefit of transactional evaporation and with the detriment of high interest rates. But you get a taste of what transactional capitalization could mean to our nation with what's happened with credit cards. If you didn't have to pay them back, everything would have been fine. Nuts, in a way, but it's true. That's a very interesting observation, and you're totally right how I sidestepped that on the states, because you could do it. I would hate to see that happen.
The mechanism's already in place.
It is. And most states had their own banking systems before the Fed. Yeah. And one of the reasons we needed the gold standard is, well, what is a dollar? And states deviated from that all the time. This is a real good question. So what he's pointed out is that in some countries, if you deposit money, you are taxed. Now, in most of those countries, the volume of transactions are not as high as ours. So they don't have that advantage. And the other part to it is they're selective. They're usually taxing if you're so-and-so and you're coming in, and they'll tax you as you go out. And so it's cumbersome, and it's not covering all the transactions, and they have way less transactions than we do. And it usually is to augment income taxes and excise taxes and other things they already have. And in a lot of countries, there's a lot of graft and corruption, and it is nothing but a funnel for the leaders to pad their own bank accounts elsewhere. And that's why you got leaders in Africa who walk away with billions of dollars and the rest of the country starves. But it's not an unknown thing. And we have had transactional taxes proposed here, but what was odd about them is it was like, let's tax the transactions. And it's like, how on earth are we going to keep track of the transactions? Can't. Look at the infrastructure we built in for withholding on income, the decades to build that out. that's why I say transactions that result in a deposit in the bank. All you're worried about is the bank. It's the bank's requirement to take that 0.76%. And guess what else? When I say it's evaporated, it's written off, the money supply, there's a good reason for that. Because if the bank had to go put it in an escrow and take this one, put it in an escrow, and then send it to here and account for it, you would have doubled the overhead of transactions. And you don't want to do that. We're trying to bring the fat of the financial centers down. So they write, you take a check, you deposit it, they credit for 99.24%, and that other 0.76% is gone. It disappeared in thin air, just like the Fed makes the money come out of thin air. That's a good question. So again, the question is, why don't people just send their money overseas to avoid this thing? Okay, and two-part answer to that is, first of all, we're already in a more onerous position of which, your income is taxed at 20 or 40%. And yeah, some of us do send our money overseas, but most people don't, And then there's all these regulations about that. But what you can simply do, this one is the easiest to enforce. In fact, I'm fond of saying our tax code today, as illustrated by Apple, is 7,500 pages high. I don't know how high that is, 15 reams of 500. My tax code is a yellow Post-it. Take 0.7% of every deposit. No ifs, ands, or buts. There would be one piece you'd add to it. If you're going to write a check to Deutsche Bank, take 0.76% of that money, and no way to escape. And it's very easy to ensure compliance. This is at the banking level. They're overseen by the OTC. This is part of a normal banking audit would be, are you evaporating? And there are criminal charges if you don't. It's not your money. Banks are loath to do things that they're not supposed to do that way. And if they're just basically saying every time money comes in, sorry, we do this, yeah, there's no way to get out of it. If you received a check from Germany from a friend of yours, could you deposit in England? Sure. That can happen.
So when you look at this from the standpoint of most people are scared of the unknown. They know what they have now, but they're scared of something that's going to change and be different, because it could be worse, it could be better. It's taken you a while to explain this to us. This is way above average intelligence people here. Now, when you look at it from the standpoint of who's against this, who could want to declare war on you and torpedo this idea, because suddenly, as an example, in Congress, being able to dole out favors with income tax, that's one of their sources of power. We can create some little legislation so all the people who make golf clubs under 5 pounds can
get a tax credit.
Get a tax write-off.
Yeah.
And so that gives them their ability to grant favors. And so you donate to my campaign, I can give you a favor. There's certainly, you mentioned the bankers would be against you. Can you kind of talk through the opposition parties? And because of the fear of the unknown, it's very easy to say, well, that would be a scary path to go down. And then how do you kind of right the ship when people are throwing missiles at you?
So fear of the unknown is the biggest issue. It's the biggest issue for every one of us. All we have to fear is fear itself. It's very true. And fear is very scary. So who would be against this? Who would be for this? This is about as nonpartisan as it gets. You're saying to the Democrats, you don't have to cut spending. You're saying to the Republicans, oh, we'll reduce taxes. You're saying to the members of Congress, you're not on the hook for a deficit anymore. And you're saying to all your constituents, I'm going to reduce your taxes to less than 1%. I think Congress would be thrilled. I think the Republicans would be thrilled. I think the Democrats would be thrilled. I liked your comment about this being an audience that digs in deeper, because it truly is. And I'm not going to put down people who don't think deeper, but if the only thing you heard was you only have to pay about 1% in taxes now, and your congressmen are fine, and there's no more deficit, do you need to know more? As a taxpayer, as the average voter out there. And, you know, we'd all be saying, yeah, let's do it, if we weren't such deep thinkers and thinking of all the alternatives. So I think for the common person in the street, they look at it and they go, wait a minute. You mean to tell me I get to keep all of these withholdings from my paycheck, and I'm going to get this tiny piece out at the bank, and everything else is okay? I'm for it. And if they were a little more altruistic and concerned about the whole nation, and you said, well, and then we can add this other piece and get rid of the debt too, because the debt doesn't really mean that much to most people. It's this theoretical thing, you know. If it was cheap enough, they'd say, okay. Yeah, good. So this guy's not paid to be here as my fall man? That ought to be the one thing we change. Because what we want to do is make our nation look as attractive as possible for anyone else. And I would think that if we did charge, you know, the 0.76%, we're not changing much. When you're in Ireland or you're Apple Corporation, you're putting money somewhere else out there, you are paying taxes to that sovereignty at a lower rate than in the US, but you're still paying taxes, and it's in Ireland, you know? So what corporations have to do is go borrow against that because they have capital needs here. I think corporate America would go, hallelujah, bring it all back in, and if you sweetened it with an amnesty period, and as long as the check was coming from, you know, a foreign bank back into the US, you said, well, we don't evaporate that. You wouldn't cut that $475 trillion down, you would increase it, and it would be over and above it, and you'd be fine. So you could do that, and I would. That's what, I mean, if I were voting and empowered to do that, I would do that, because today it's a chess game, global chess game, and what we need are the tools to play the smartest game of chess possible. And these tools allow us to supercharge our economy, make us really attractive, and really gain dominance in that area. What we're doing today is pulling the rug out from underneath ourselves. I think getting rid of corporate income taxes would be a huge incentive for them to have all their earnings counted right here in the US instead of Ireland or Cyprus or one of those areas. I think they would love this. Oh, the question was, is there an incentive? You know, what sort of incentive would there be for those large corporations to bring their tens of billions of dollars back? And my answer was, I think getting rid of corporate income taxes would be the incentive they'd jump at.
All right.
So the question was, what could people in the audience do to help get this thing going? And then if I were to pick a few thought leaders out there who would endorse this that would really matter, who would they be? So I have two of my partners here tonight, and we formed the Partnership for a New Economy. It's an LLC. It's not a nonprofit. And the Partnership for a New Economy is going to create a series of videos. It's going to produce the book that will come out in the fall. It's producing a short, about 20-page book, which will be out in another week or two, in which we've kind of carefully thought through all of, you know, the mechanics of this. And we're going to launch it on Indiegogo. And we would Kickstarter, but Indiegogo allows you to get political. And so we're going to be very political. And what we'll do is send an email, if it's all right with you.
Please do.
And we'll give you the launch date, and you go on to Indiegogo and, you know, participate in that. And we will have a launch party in Boulder. And so if you want to come to the party and, you know, be on the video to show, you know, some crowd appeal, we're going to do that. And I think that that speaks to who would I like to endorse this. And I think what I have found is that the younger generation, 20 to 30-year-olds, are like this on it. And first, they think that way. You know, you guys are futurists, so you're going to think that way anyway. But they gravitate towards it immediately. So Indiegogo is predominantly younger. And I think that what is necessary is to launch it as a movement within the people of America, the grassroots level, and get that rolling first. We analyzed going to a couple of the top economists, and we found an interesting phenomena among economists. You might have this group of economists behind Obama and this group of economists behind Romney, but none of these economists are behind each other. So we can't come out as an economic theory for economists because they won't support it. But if we come out as a political movement and say this is political, then a lot of the economists will say, I knew this all along, this is great, yep, I would do it, and some will say no. But they'll probably judge it by the grassroots movement. If enough grassroots movements, they'll all say, this is what we've been saying forever. And they have said things like broaden the tax base and stuff, so, you know, I'm not making fun of them. But as far as, and I think that has to start first. Because I don't think that if we went to Warren Buffett and said, nobody's heard this except for now, you know, this many people, here's an idea. He'd probably get it and really like it, but he's not going to go public with it. Because if we mess up as a political movement, we could be just as right as possible, but if we embarrass him, he wouldn't like that. So you have to get that movement. And then I think that the people who I respect, who I think make very solid comments about the economy, I think Warren Buffett is one of the top guys, and I think Bill Gates is too. I think that it would be the CEOs of tech companies, because the way I look at this, these are financial technologies. Structured finance was a financial technology. And by the way, I've just spent the last 5 years patenting structured finance for private equity funds. So let's hope they start doing that too. But there you see, it's a tool for a PE fund to deliver a 50% higher return to the limited partners. That's a financial technology. That's what technology is about, is increasing the productivity and efficiency. And so that's what these are. These are not ideologies. These were arrived at with math and science and logic. They went against the grain of my ideologies at times. And then I discovered, oh, wait a minute, this is the better way. And I think that's the future. If we can have more logic and math and science and technology coming into our government and drop the ideologies, which are usually fear-based, we'll be better off.
So do you have a time frame for a rollout? I mean, how long before?
We're probably 2 to 4 weeks away from the Indiegogo launch, I think. We're building scribe videos, so in 3 minutes it describes transactional evaporation. Our lead is transactional evaporation. The other 3 are in the book, so people see, hey, it's a part of a whole. It's not just one little idea, and they do fit. But insofar as what, you know, Joe Voter needs to look at, and unlocks all the secrets he needs. So that's where our lead.
All right, let's give Scott a big round of applause.
Thank you.